for joining us. We have a really special guest, part of our Noblis speaker series, and Gershom Gorenberg, who's a great author and really a great historian. And he's actually wrote a very interesting book about the Codebreakers in World War II. And we've heard a lot about the Enigma Machine and the various intelligence activities going on in World War II. And this is actually an interesting aspect in terms of the campaign in North Africa. And really, as the Germans tried to go to North Africa and get into the Middle East, and how really the Codebreakers shaped a lot of the activities within that campaign. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Gershom, and thanks for today. And we look forward to hearing about your story.
Thank you so much, Rick. And it's really a pleasure to be here with all of you today, talking to you from very far away, actually from Jerusalem. So I want to start with a question which you can, if anybody wants to answer via chat, I can see your answers, which is, how many of you have a parent or a grandparent who served in North Africa during World War II? Or perhaps if you were in the military, a former commander who served in North Africa, or a member of your family who was living here? Okay, so I'm seeing a couple of answers. I suspect that if I were asking about some of the better known fronts in the Pacific or in Europe, I would probably see more answers. And this is an important aspect of the whole history of what happened in the Middle East, which is that American memory of the war against Germany tends to leap from Pearl Harbor to D-Day to we won. And yet, out of the almost 6 years of World War II, for 3 years, for over half the war, North Africa was where the British and then the Allies together fought Italy and Germany. That is to say, that was the longest running front of the war against the Axis on the, shall we say, the Western Front. And in much of that time, the rest of the Middle East was under direct threat of being conquered. But not only that, the real story of the decisive battle is an intelligence battle and an intelligence breakthrough. And that's either missing or very fragmentary and distorted in accounts of the war. So the heroes of that battle have been erased. And as I will eventually explain, it's not by accident that they have been left out. To understand this, I want to take you on a guided tour. We're going to go traveling, but this is time travel. And this is one of those guided tours that hops from one landmark to another. So I will keep reminding you of not only where we are, but when we are. So our first stop is going to be in central Cairo, Egypt, on the 1st of July, 1942. 1st of July, 1942. And if you were sitting at this cafe in central Cairo, or you were looking over those apartment buildings and department stores that were built in a city that was meant to be the Paris of the Middle East, if you looked past these to the west, toward the direction of the Nile River, you would have seen pillars of smoke rising from British General Headquarters, from the British Embassy, from the Royal Air Force Headquarters, because clerks and soldiers are burning papers. They're burning code books and secret documents, and the fire is so hot that sometimes the documents don't burn up. They're lifted up by the hot air and cast out over the city. If you wanted to get your money out of the bank, you weren't the only one. There were long lines outside of the bank. In fact, the banks were handing out worn out bills because they didn't have enough money to give to everybody who wanted to withdraw their cash. And outside the stores selling suitcases, there were also long lines. That morning, July 1st, a British code officer by the name of June Watkins got off duty. She was working in the basement of a downtown hotel where the Royal Air Force had their code room. And on the street, she ran into a South African officer she knew, and he offered to take her for coffee at Gropey's Garden Cafe, which was a favorite hangout of British officers. But when they got there, the garden was closed, so they had to drink their coffee inside. And June went down to the ladies' room and looked out the window, and what she saw was the restaurant staff was out in the garden painting signs in German welcoming Erwin Rommel and his officers. If you had gone to the train station, the scene you would have seen, well, probably many of you have seen the movie Casablanca, and you remember the scene of what the Paris train station looked like as everybody expected the Germans to come in and everybody's trying to get out of Paris. Well, the Cairo train station looked the same way that day, except without the rain. Loads and loads of people were trying to get on trains either south to the Sudan or east across the Sinai Desert to Palestine to get away from the Germans. And the embassies in Cairo were also sending out messages about this. In fact, here's one message that was sent out on the 3rd of July from the Turkish Embassy in Cairo to the Foreign Affairs Minister in Ankara, and he says that the number of Egyptian Jews who want visas for Turkey is rising all the time. What am I supposed to do? And 3 days later, he gets a response back that says, say no, don't take any of those refugees. Now, you're reading these in English, of course. So why are you reading them in English? Because they were sent by radio. They were picked up, decoded by the government communications headquarters of Britain, the British agency whose very existence was unknown to the public. If you saw the movie The Imitation Game, you saw a highly inaccurate version of how GCHQ broke the Germans' Enigma code. Well, they also broke the diplomatic codes of at least 24 countries, including, by the way, US diplomatic codes, and including Turkey. So these are copies of the telegrams that were translated into English and sent to a very, very select group of high British intelligence and political figures. Everybody knew at this point that Cairo knew that Cairo was about to suffer the same fate as Paris or Belgrade or Warsaw. And to understand that, it could help to take a look at the map. 10 days earlier, the German and Italian army under General Erwin Rommel had conquered Tobruk in Libya, the small port of Tobruk, and taken captive 35,000 South African, Indian, and British soldiers. The British army appeared to be on the edge of collapse, and in 10 days, Rommel's army advanced from Tobruk Rommel. That's Erwin Rommel. Was the most famous of Germany's generals. His fame in Germany actually began before the war in Tactics, which was really a memoir about his experience as an infantry commander during the Great War, what we now call World War I. What Rommel learned from the trench battles of the Great War was avoid static warfare. You have to move fast, find a weak point around, quick movement. In World War II, he became the personification of blitzkrieg, of fast mobile warfare, now with to understand what was about to happen at El Alamein. We need to travel in time again and go back another nearly 3 years to the first week of 1939, to the train tracks of Poland, and specifically to 2 trains, one entering Poland and one leaving. The first train left Berlin on the 3rd of September 1939, 2 days after Germany invaded Poland, and it headed east into Poland, and it was codenamed, bizarrely enough, America. That was Adolf Hitler's private train. He wanted to see his army in action. He had a battalion in charge of his security, and the person in charge of that battalion was his favorite general, Erwin Rommel. Rommel wrote lots of letters to his wife. He wrote very proudly to his wife that he'd been invited to sit next to Hitler at lunch, and that he, Rommel, quote, was allowed to chat for almost 2 hours, unquote, with Hitler about military problems. Rommel says Hitler is, quote, extraordinarily friendly toward me. Rommel worshipped Hitler. Now, exactly at the time that this is going on, the head of the SS and Gestapo, Reinhard Heydrich, tells Germany's military intelligence chief, Wilhelm Canaris, what the plans are for Poland. And he says, the nobility, the Catholic clergy, and the Jews must be killed. And an officer who was serving under the German chief of military staff, Halder, also wrote in his journal that some of what he had heard from Halder about plans for Poland were too awful to write down. So I leave it to you to consider whether or not Rommel knew, sitting with Hitler for lunch, what the plans were for the civilian population of Poland. But Rommel was busy being elated watching the invasion because it fit his idea of rapid advance in mechanized form, armored divisions breaking through the enemy defenses. The thing was that tanks weren't the only machine needed, because headquarters needed to be in touch with the commanders of the tank divisions, who needed to be in contact with the units under them. The key to blitzkrieg, as one historian wrote, was speed of attack through speed of communications. And the only way to do that was by radio. But when you send battle plans by radio, you might as well shout them out to the world. As another historian wrote about World War II, only a traitor used radio, only a fool did not. That was the conundrum. You had to encrypt your messages in some sort of way, but traditional codes and ciphers were too easy to break. A cipher, as you know, one letter replaces another. So if a code breaker gets a message and Z is the most common letter in the message, you know that Z stands for E. It's really easy. There's more complicated codes and ciphers, but the principle is the same. But what if the cipher changed with every letter? What if you needed to transmit EEE and it came out as TZQ, on, seemingly random? The solution, the thing that could do that, was in fact a machine called the Enigma. This is a picture of the Enigma with its cover open. It looks almost like a typewriter. There's a 26-character keyboard. In the back, there's these 3 wheels with gears on them. Each wheel has 26 contacts on each side and wires inside connecting the contacts, but the pattern of how they're connected is hidden. Contact number 1 on the left could be connected to any of the 26 on the other side, and contact number 2 can be connected to any of the remaining 25. So let's say you press the letter B on the keyboard. A little burst of electricity runs through the tangle of the wires inside the wheels and comes out and lights up a little light with a letter on it on this light board here. It will light up any letter could possibly be lit up except for the one that you pressed. But at the same time, the wheels move. So the next time you press even the same letter, it will come out as something different. The wheels move, the pattern changes. It creates what looks like gibberish. In 1926, the German Navy adopted Enigma as its encryption tool, then the Army, then the Air Force. The beauty of the device was, first of all, as you see, it's the size of a typewriter. It weighs 15 pounds. It can be carried in a command car with the commander. To decipher a message that was sent by Enigma, all you had to do was type it in to another Enigma machine, and the clear text, the original text, would light up on the light board. If you have a machine wired the same way, and if you know all the starting positions. That's a big if, because the number of starting positions is 1.5 times 10 to the 20th, 150 quintillion possible ways to set up the machine. And that's the small number, because the number of possible ways to wire the wheels looks like this, 5 times 10 to the 92nd. It's completely obvious that no code breaker can ever test that many combinations. There's no mathematical solution. This is unbreakable encryption, a term that you've heard in other contexts more recently. But as I said, there were 2 trains. Let's talk about the other train. The second train left Warsaw on September 6, 1939. It was running away from the Germans. It was going east. And on board was the man who ultimately can be said to have defeated Rommel, though Rommel never knew of his existence. That man was Marian Rejewski, a young Polish mathematician, 34 years old, who'd had to leave his wife and 2 kids behind in Warsaw. 10 years earlier, he'd been working on his master's thesis in math when he was recruited by Polish military intelligence's Cipher Bureau. And in the autumn of 1932, he was assigned to break Enigma. What he did was he had the idea of applying the field of mathematics known as permutation theory. We'll say that in hindsight, this looks really obvious. Lots of things look obvious in hindsight. Nobody else ever looked at the problem that way. Within 2 to 3 months, he figured out what the wiring was. He cracked that 5 times 10 to the 92nd problem and figured out what the wiring was of the Enigma machine. Then he and 2 assistants found ways to find the settings, often based on a German security measure that actually, unknown to the Germans, created an opening. But as the war got closer, the Germans were changing the setting daily, and Rejewski and his 2 assistants couldn't keep up. So in July of 1939, they invited 2 people from Britain, 2 British cryptologists, to Warsaw and shared their work. And the British took home with them the information about Enigma. In September of 1939, as I said, Rejewski escaped Warsaw, eventually reaching Romania and then France, where he continued to advise the British until the fall of France. The best British codebreakers never believed that Rejewski figured out the wiring on his own because that was impossible. They were certain that the Poles must have stolen a machine, and that's how he knew the wiring. But all of the British work on Enigma during the war was based on the foundation that Rejewski gave them. While Rejewski is busy fleeing Poland, GCHQ settles into its new location, an estate called Bletchley Park, which is a hideous mansion on another rail line, the one connecting Oxford and Cambridge in the British countryside. And its rapidly expanding wartime staff moves in. One of the people who moved in, a name you've probably seen before, was Alan Turing, a Cambridge mathematician. Based on Rejewski's work, he designed something called the Bomba, a giant machine that ran through Enigma settings looking for one that could have produced a particular text. For this to work, though, you needed to have a good idea of a text that would appear in a message. That is, it depended on a crib, a known piece of text. Or to put it differently, it depended on the Germans ignoring basic code security, using the same phrases over and over again, and on them being certain that it didn't matter because they had perfect unbreakable encryption. One of Turing's key allies was this man, Gordon Welchman, another Cambridge mathematician. Ethereal academician, writing a textbook on algebraic geometry when the war started, arrives at Bletchley Park the day after Britain declares war. It transformed him. Besides coming up with the design improvement that made Turing's bomb actually work, Welchman's really big idea was code breaking is not academic work. It's not something for a genius alone in a small room. Enigma is producing an industrial-sized stream of information on German supplies, deployments, plans, personnel, and more. In November 1939, before Bletchley Park had deciphered a single Enigma message, Welchman wrote a proposal essentially to create a code-breaking production line, to break the work up into research and production, to break up the production into different tasks, to work more than one shift a day. Bletchley Park goes from a staff of 100 when the war started, only a handful of whom were working on Enigma, to thousands later on. He discovered himself as a manager, as a mover, as a problem solver. In a sense, Bletchley Park was a utterly top secret high-tech startup. At first, with the help of the Poles, Bletchley Park begins finding Enigma settings, reading messages. It's not a one-time break. You need to break the settings every day for every network. And then you have to translate the messages, and then they're written in all sorts of internal German shortcuts and shorthand, and you have to make sense of them as the the group called Hut 3 was in charge of translating and making sense of the messages. They said, we were eavesdroppers, strangers reading stolen scraps of other people's correspondence. That was also a kind of code breaking. Okay, time for some fast time travel again. Let's go back to Africa, September 1940. After Mussolini dithered for a very long time, he decides to join Germany in the war against Britain. An Italian army from the Italian colony of Libya invades Egypt, which was then essentially a British protectorate, although officially independent, and reaches 60 miles into Britain, a place called Sidi Barrani on the coast. In December 1940, Britain counterattacks and takes all of Cyrenaica, the eastern part of Libya, taking the town of Benghazi and going even further. By the beginning of 1941, Hitler decides that he has to intervene in Libya because the Italians might lose the country and the British could threaten Axis-controlled Europe from the south. So he turns to his favorite brilliant general, Erwin Rommel, and sends him to Libya with the task of holding the line in the center of Libya around the town of Agela. But instead, remember, Rommel's the man of mobile warfare. He attacks. He retakes Benghazi and most of eastern Libya. Everybody thinks he's a totally brilliant general. In fact, the reality was that just at this time, the British had decided they needed to defend Greece and had moved most of their forces there. So when Rommel counterattacked, he faced very weak resistance. This pattern repeated itself the following year, fall of 1941, winter of 42. The British attack. They take Cyrenaica, eastern Libya, but then Japan enters the war, and Rommel retakes most of Libya. Rommel becomes known as the Desert Fox. He's always pictured with his captured British sand goggles strapped on his cap. He seems to have a sixth sense about enemy intentions. Well, in April 1942, Welchman's crew finally breaks into the Enigma networks used between Berlin and Rommel's headquarters. And one of the messages that they decode is this one. And the message says that as part of an appreciation, that is to say, a British appreciation of the situation in the island of Malta, it is reported from a good source that the British will not be strong enough to launch an offensive before 1 June. Rommel has incredible information. The British can't launch an offensive until the 1st of June. This message ends up on the desk of a 24-year-old woman named Margaret Story, who'd been recruited 2 years before in the official task of untrained clerk. As with Welchman, going to Bletchley Park transformed her life, because by 1942, Bletchley Park's success at decrypting German messages was getting into its own commander's nightmares. What are they deciphering of us? We're reading their codes. What if they're reading our codes? So Margaret Story is made research specialist in charge of finding hints of enemy intelligence in decoded German messages. I wish I could show you her picture, but she left almost no trace in her life but her work. It took me many, many months to find people who'd known her. They told me, I can draw you a picture in words. They told me, picture her as slight, wearing dark cardigans, as always smoking. They said she was self-effacing, introspective, very intelligent, had daunting intelligence, had absolutely formidable intelligence, was shy, was very shy, was the brain. She knew 9 languages. She did have a sense of humor, but she only showed it in top secret documents directed to 5 or 6 people who had the highest security clearance. More messages follow from Cairo, from the good source. This is one of Margaret Story's reports on the information that's flowing out of Egypt through the Germans. It tells British positions, plans, and mistakes. Rommel's sixth sense of British plans was actually extraordinary intelligence, probably the best flow of intelligence that the Germans had during the entire war. The British have to know who or what is the good source. Well, in retrospect, I can tell you that there are a number of suspects. Those suspects included the possibility that it was a spy brought to Egypt by the famous Hungarian explorer Laszlo Amasi, who became a German officer during the war, who was also turned into an extremely romantic and utterly fictional character in the novel The English Patient. So maybe it was Amasi's spy. Maybe the source actually was somebody connected to King Farouk of Egypt, the 22-year-old king with the pro-Axis leanings, who in fact had learned of British intent to invade Persia in 1941 and even attempted to warn Germany. On the other hand, maybe the Germans were breaking a British code. After all, in 1937, the head of MI6's counter-espionage division, British Foreign Intelligence's counter-espionage chief, Major Valentine Vivian, wrote a scathing report on security at the embassy in Berlin, and how open it was to possibly a break-in and theft by the Gestapo. I'm going to leave that mystery, who was the good source, to the book. You want to find out? I have to leave you with something to find in the book. But let's jump forward in time to June 21st, 1942 again. Rommel has just taken Tobruk. His orders are to advance only as far as the Egyptian border. But then he receives a message from the good source. The message says, if Rommel intends to take the Nile Delta, this is a suitable moment. The British are on their knees. He says, this is your chance. Rommel was a gambler who just got an inside tip. He invades Egypt. He needs to get it to Alexandria in order to have a port to receive supplies. He needs to get beyond Alexandria to Palestine to reach the RAF bases there so his ships can't be attacked from the air. The good source tells him that the British will mount their defense at a place called Mersa Matruh, a port on the Egyptian coast. Well, by carefully comparing Allied and Axis intelligence documents, I realized something quite astounding. This is precisely when the good source went silent. Just before the following thing happened. On June 25th, the head of Britain's Middle East Command, General Claude Auchinleck, decided to take command in the field. He leaves Cairo and takes command in the field, and he changes the place of defense, of mounting the defensive line to El Alamein. And the reason he does that is it's the spot where the coast and the deep cliffs of the Qatar Depression are closest together. By creating a defensive line there, he has a line that Rommel can attack but can't go around. The good source is silent. Rommel is clueless. He reaches El Alamein on the 1st of July, 1942, as Cairo is in a panic. He's expecting one last minor battle on his way to Alexandria and Cairo, and instead he's blocked. Weeks of fighting, he can't advance. His supply lines are truck convoys stretching all the way back to Libya. And by now, Welchman's unit in England is reading all of his major radio networks, telling the British command everything that Rommel has planned. El Alamein was literally the line in the sand where Britain stopped the Axis forces. It took until November and another new British commander, Bernard Montgomery, before they drove the Axis forces back. After Montgomery's victory, Winston Churchill gave a speech, a famous speech, where he said that this was the end of the beginning of the war. But I would argue that the real end of the beginning was the first battle of El Alamein in July 1942, simply stopping Rommel. Once Rommel couldn't reach the port of Alexandria, he was essentially trapped in the desert. The victory in the secret war was a key, perhaps the key, to victory in the field. Rommel himself never knew of the role of Rayuski, of Welchman, of Alan Turing, or Margaret Story in his defeat. But I would say there were three key elements in the success against Enigma. The first of these is, and these elements I think are relevant, remain relevant to today. Rayuski looked at the problem in a way no one else thought of. In fact, I would suggest that the same law governs code breaking and safe cracking. Any lock that one human mind can design, some other human mind will eventually see a way to break. The first mind snaps shut around its solution. The second mind has to be unlocked and open. The second thing about Enigma was people had to use it. Human beings had to use it. They took shortcuts. They repeated phrases. They got careless. The flaw in the machine was the human beings who used it, and always will be. And the other important factor was not just carelessness, but overconfidence. Welchman wrote years later, the Germans could have seen their security mistakes if they hadn't believed Enigma was unbreakable. He wrote, "We got lucky." There's one final piece. Why did the story, or the true story, remain hidden? After the war, former Axis officers came up with all sorts of bizarre explanations for why the good source had stopped sending information. They didn't know, and afterwards, when they heard, couldn't believe that Enigma had been broken. On the British side, however, this secret document, 9th of April 1945, helps explain things. This is part of a order that was sent out for everybody who knew about breaking Enigma. And it told them that they needed to keep this secret for the rest of their lives. This was not a story that you could tell after the war. And there were several reasons given, but this is reason number one. No possible excuse must be given to the Germans to explain away their complete defeat by force of arms. They will seize on any excuse to maintain that they were not well and fairly beaten, which is what happened after World War I. And the uncanny success of our intelligence would offer them just such an excuse. In other words, if they know how they lost, they might want to try again. So those who fought the War of Shadows played an extraordinary role in the victory. And for the victory to last, they were told, history cannot remember you. Well, the pieces have finally come out almost 80 years later. I hope to have honored those people. I believe some of the lessons from their work hold true today, and I hope that you enjoy reading the full story. Thank you very much.
Hey, thanks for your presentation. It was very, very interesting. We did have, and we can open it up for some questions, and we did have one in the chat. And the question was this related to the 200 days of dread?
Yeah, okay, that's a great question. That's an expression from the Hebrew, actually, Matam Yemei HaChareda, which was the period in Palestine from May to November of 1942, when everybody in Palestine expected that the Germans were on the edge of conquering Palestine. Now, actually, in many ways, that danger had passed by July, but of course, people didn't know that. They only realized that the danger had passed in November when Rommel was driven back. What they certainly didn't know, what nobody knew at the time except for a tiny group of people, was the role that intelligence had played in ending that threat. But I actually interviewed, when I started my research on this book, I interviewed two men who were then in their 90s, who have since passed away, two of Israel's most famous writers, Chaim Guri and Uri Avneri, who were both at 18 at the time. And they both told me that at the time that this was going on, it was simply obvious. Palestine. In fact, Guri told me that the store owner said, "Don't bother paying."
Thanks. And we did have so a few more questions coming in, and one was, I guess Rommel's demise. There was, I guess some debate on like how close he was to Hitler or not close to Hitler, and did he turn on Hitler and kill himself like Rommel? Do you remember what happened to Rommel?
Yes, I'll tell you about that. First of all, after he was defeated in Africa, Rommel was put in charge, first of all, of occupying Italy after Italy. And then in 1944, France, the Atlantic Wall. Very soon after he was recovering. His that he didn't by 1944 plot and gave him two choices. He could either be put on trial for treason, or he could take poison and his death would be exploded. Hero's hero took the choice of killing himself. Whether or not he would Hitler, extremely questionable and is a matter of debate among historians, especially German historians, to this day. It seems more likely that one of the conspirators who was close to him implicated him, but that he was not actually involved in the plot. But as I said, that's a realm of doubt to this day. However, this is again history serving political purposes after the war. After the war, when West Germany became independent again and became part of NATO, it became very important to have, as it were, clean German military figures to be inspiration to the new German army. And Rommel's memory was resuscitated as a good German, as one who had been patriotic but not a Nazi. And his death, allegedly as part of this plot, helped build the legend of Rommel as a good German.
Thanks. And what was the role of British intelligence in helping the Allies bottle up the Germans and the Italians in Tunisia, forcing their mass surrender?
Well, this is also an important point. The turning point for British intelligence in reading the Enigma networks in Africa was really right at the point of the beginning of the Battle of El Alamein. So by July of 1942, they were regularly reading, not all of, but much of the traffic on all of the important German Army and Air Force networks in North Africa, as well as the Italian Navy networks. And that was an incredibly important factor in the eventual Allied victory in North Africa, driving the Axis completely out of North Africa, and that led to the invasion of Italy. I should note here that in November of 1942, another incredible piece of American history that doesn't get enough recognition, the first place that the United States put troops on the ground on the Western Front against Germany and Italy was actually against Vichy France in invading Morocco and Algeria in November of 1942 in what's known as Operation Torch. So at that point, American troops were advancing from West Africa, and the British were advancing from the eastern side of North Africa. They pushed the Germans into a enclave in Tunisia, and eventually took all of Tunisia and used that as the launching pad for the first step back into Europe, which was first Sicily and then the Italian mainland. And all of that was expedited in a very, very important manner by this incredible flow of information from Bletchley Park by reading Enigma.
Now, was that also used, or how was it used in disrupting like the shipping or resupplying, the Mediterranean, because they had, of course, the supply chain is crucial, right, to reinforce the.
Yeah. So there was another branch of Bletchley Park that was in charge of breaking Italian codes and managed to break the Italian naval codes. And I have to tell you, okay, this is like a historian's ecstasy, is going through these documents, like opening up these bound volumes of decoded messages from nearly 80 years ago and seeing page after page of what they were reading from the other side. And what you see there in the Italian naval messages is this convoy is leaving Naples on this day. It's going to take this route, this compass bearing until this point, and then it's going to turn in this point. And all of that information is flowing to British naval and Air Force headquarters in Africa. The big problem that they had was you can't let the other side know that you know, because then they'll change their codes and all of your work will go to waste, right? So what they would do is they sent up a reconnaissance plane, which just happened to go exactly where the ship was. And so the people on the ship said, oh, British air reconnaissance spotted us. That's why we're getting bombed now or attacked by the British Navy. So that they never knew that, in fact, that plane was there because it knew where to be to look for the ship. And what the Italian intelligence, what the Italian radiograms also revealed was which ship was carrying what. And so what they did is they focused on the ships carrying fuel to cut off the fuel supply to Rommel's forces in Africa. Because what you have to understand is the distances were incredible and local supplies didn't exist. I mean, if people had known in those days that there was oil under Libya, the whole war would have been different, but thank God they did not. So you had to carry oil hundreds of miles to the front. Sometimes if you started off with 2 gallons of gasoline to take to the tanks, 1 gallon got burnt by the truck taking the other gallon. If you bombed the ship carrying that gasoline, then the German and Italian forces couldn't bring their other supplies forward in trucks. And in fact, I've seen report after report, translated German reports from the front saying we're short on ammunition, we're short on food. There was even one cable where the Air Force is sending back something. Can't you send us, the Luftwaffe, you have to send us better food. You're only sending us beans and lentils. And the problem is that when the pilots eat beans and lentils, they get stomach pains, and the higher they fly, the worse the stomach pains are. So they can't fly at high altitude because we're not getting the right food supplies. And all of that was due in a chain of events to bombing the fuel ships in the Mediterranean.
Thanks. That was very, very insightful. Now, do you think that some of the events that you covered contributed to, and I have to pronounce this, so kibbutzism in the region, and there is artifacts like remain today to keep the area divided?
Well, all of these events had a huge effect on the politics of the Middle East afterwards. And that's something that I explore in a lot of depth in the book, is because besides the intelligence affair I've told you about, there's layers upon layers of other intrigues. First of all, on the one hand, the kibbutzim, the Jewish communes in Palestine already existed, but one of the questions which divided the British High Command was whether to recruit Jews from Palestine to the British Army, and in particular, at the point where they thought that Palestine was likely to fall to the Germans, one branch of the British military, which was known as the Special Operations Executive, that was the top secret agency that was in charge of training and supporting partisans, began training young Jews from Palestine to be partisans behind the line of the Germans after their expected conquest of Palestine. And in fact, I met people who were part of, one of those 90-plus-year-old men that I interviewed said, "Oh yes, when I was 18 years old, the British taught me how to make a time delay fuse that we were supposed to use against the Germans." On the other hand, there were these intrigues running through the Egyptian government about, on the one hand, they hated the British as the colonial oppressor. The question was, should we support the British against the Axis, who are worse, or should we support the Axis against the British? And that led to a great deal of complications. I'll just tell you as a sweetener that one of the people who supported helping the Axis and was in fact arrested as collaborating with an Axis spy ring was a young Egyptian officer, unknown at the time, by the name of Anwar al-Sadat, who spent the rest of the war in jail. And in fact, the British ambassador wrote at the time, if this man has been giving information to the enemy, he should be shot. Well, I would say that this is a lesson that the first chapter of somebody's life doesn't tell you necessarily what's going to happen in later chapters. And I'm glad that they did not have Anwar Sadat shot at that point. but I actually saw the place where the ambassador said this man should be shot.
Okay, thanks. And then we have a couple other questions from the chat. And the other one was the the Enigma machine specific, and you may have answered this with the resupply, but Operation Mincemeat, where the Allies were able to invade Italy and Sicily, was the breaking of the Enigma code. Did that help with that invasion?
Certainly, this was a continuing what. Let me put it this way. As I said before, breaking Enigma wasn't something you did once. You essentially had to do it every day. And as the Germans never believed that Enigma had been broken, but sometimes in the course of things, they upgraded their security. So there were always new challenges. But Bletchley Park continued to expand, continued to break in, and that affected the entire continuation of the war. And then there's these things that people write. There's a very famous statement that if it hadn't been for Enigma, the war would have lasted 2 years longer. We have no idea. You can't run history twice as a controlled experiment, once with and once without. But what we know is that there's battle after battle in which this information was of crucial importance to Allied commanders. And of course, after the United States entered the war, two very important things happened. One is, once the British and the Americans were fighting side by side, the British began to share under very secret conditions some of this information with the Americans. And the other fascinating thing is that they stopped breaking American codes, which they'd been doing up to Pearl Harbor. And in fact, I have a note that Churchill wrote to Roosevelt in, I think, the end of January of 1942, in which he says, we really have to talk about your code security. Your diplomatic codes, they're sort of easy to break. In fact, we've been breaking some of them too. Now, naturally, we stopped now that we're allies, but you should look into this. And at the bottom of the message, it says, please burn this after reading. It's a fortunate thing for historians that that instruction was ignored and the message survived. But they continued to break access codes throughout the war. Another factor, which was very important at D-Day, interestingly enough, was the breaking of Japanese codes. Now, it's famous that the breaking of Japanese codes is directly responsible for the American victory at Midway. By breaking the Japanese naval code, the American Navy knew there was this huge effort made to break this code after the disaster of Pearl Harbor. They managed to break the code. They knew that the Japanese Navy was about to strike Midway. An American fleet set sail, took the Japanese completely by surprise, sank 4 of their aircraft carriers, and that was the turning point in the war in the Pacific. But what's less known is that the Japanese ambassador in Berlin, the Japanese military attaché, and the Japanese naval attaché all toured the German defenses of the Atlantic Wall in France. And they all sent long messages back describing how Germany was going to defend the Atlantic Wall. And all of those messages were broken by Allied intelligence and provided vital information on the defenses of France that helped in D-Day.
And then, and one piece that you haven't that you didn't talk about, which of course for those who have ever watched the movie Patton or heard about Patton versus Rommel, and did the British help feed Patton information about Rommel through these code break-ins, or did he just read his book and figure out his tactics and go defeat Rommel on his own?
Well, I think that the story here is there's several pieces of this. One is, as I said, in terms of what Rommel's plans were, specific plans. What are the Germans going to do at a particular time, and what's their supply situation and stuff like that? That information was flowing to Allied headquarters in Africa. So American commanders at the very top level were getting that kind of information as well. The other thing is learning how to do mobile warfare. And, I didn't go into detail about that stage of the war after the American invasion of North Africa, but what's very clear is that when the Americans first landed in North Africa, I hate to put it this way, but they were amateurs. Everybody, Patton included, they had ideas. But something that's amazing is that before the beginning of World War II, right before the beginning of World War II, America, according to the American Army itself, had the 18th largest army in the world. The expansion of the army was incredible, and it also had to learn how to fight. And when the British commander-in-chief visited an American training exercise in 1942, he said, "These guys know what to do on the level of small, major, multi-unit tactical knowledge. Like, they don't know what they're doing. They didn't know what they were up against." And the Americans kept wanting to invade Europe immediately, and the British kept telling them, "You guys aren't ready. You have no idea what you're up against. We've been fighting these people for 2 years, and they're way better trained than you are." So what really ended up happening in a fascinating way is that the battles in North Africa were the training ground where Patton and all of the other American commanders, Eisenhower too, learned how to fight the British. That was like the dress rehearsal for invading Europe. By attacking at the edge first, they were able to get experience that served them in the final confrontation in Europe itself.
Okay, thanks. I don't see any more questions in the chat, so I'm not really sure if anyone has any follow-up questions. It was definitely an interesting topic. I mean, it's very fascinating and interesting, and you can learn a lot from history, and you never take things for granted just because you think your stuff's secured. If you get overconfident, it could come back to haunt you, which was a very interesting analogy that you used.
I'm just going to finish with two thoughts here, or three things. First, I want to thank all of you. Wonderful for me to get the chance to talk to you. This is the day that the book is coming out, and this was a great way to start. The second thing is, just to emphasize your point, I think that even though a lot of this technology seems Stone Age to us today in the age of transistors and microchips and gigabytes, the human factor, it's still the same human beings. And studying the human factor, I think, is really important for everybody who's engaged in security today. And the last thing I want to say is, I started out as a daily journalist, and you'd cover events as they happened. And then when I started doing history and seeing documents that were 30 and 50 and 70 years old, I said, wow, every story I thought I knew, there's another story underneath that, and another story underneath that that's hidden that we don't know about. And the pleasure of doing this work is bringing those stories out. So I hope you enjoy them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for attending, everyone. And of course, we'll get distributions of some of the books, and we'll I know I have one. I'll bring it to Penrose once I'm done reading it. But thanks, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.